once that the Biden administration got through Congress in the first term. So could you just sort of run down what is being affected here?
Yeah. And so the history of this is that after 2 years of sending mixed signals on China, um, Trump and Robert Lighthizer, his trade guy, finally succeeded in launching a full-blown 301 investigation of Chinese dumping, Chinese subsidies,
Right.
uh, and they put 25% tariffs on an increasing share of Chinese exports. Now, what Biden has done, now that the results of that 301 investigation are in, one of the most extreme examples that also affects America's efforts to compete of Chinese subsidy, Chinese dumping, is EVs. And so the focus of this was EVs and also EV batteries and also solar. But what China does in the case of EVs is it has deep, deep, deep subsidies. 15 years ago, China had 0.1% of the global market in electric vehicles. It now has 60%. And it's done this by deep subsidies and by pricing to market. And because this is not a free market operation, China can look country by country by country and underprice everybody else by 20 or 30 or 40%, whatever it takes to just grab market share. And so in Mexico, classic case of a third country, China's EVs underprice everybody else's EVs by about 30%. And so it is so the antithesis of a free market that this is a kind of extreme case where a retaliatory tariff makes total sense. And what's interesting is that apart from a lot of griping by some of the business community that has reasons for wanting to do deals with China, the whole chorus of outrage from free traders has been damped way down. Biden has public opinion on his side. Biden has a lot of Republicans on his side, and the climate has just drastically changed in 10 years. But I think
Yeah.
here's the other key point. Um, Trump's pushback on China was chaotic. It was incoherent. He himself would go back and forth on what he wanted to do because every once in a while she would give him some kind of corrupt deal. And there were all kinds of ongoing struggles between the Wall Street doves in his cabinet and the China hawks who were making policy. And it was completely inconclusive. What Biden has done is he's brought a coherence to China policy.
Yeah. A couple things there. So, I mean, the fact that the only real response from Trump to this was you should have done it earlier. That's what you say when you lost, right? That's what you say when you blew the policy. There's a lot of alignment between the parties now on this set of policies, and that's why I think you haven't seen a whole lot of pushback. There has been in some environmental circles the pushback of the idea of, well, wait a second, we want cheaper EVs so we can bring the benefits of decarbonization to a broader class of Americans. People can't afford these electric vehicles, and if we made them more affordable, then we would speed up the transition. Now, the flip side of that is that you can't divorce this from the politics. Biden needs states in the Midwest that have a lot of vehicle production in them, places like Michigan in particular. And if he loses, we know where the trajectory is going to go. Big oil literally is bribing Donald Trump. Trump has asked for $1 billion from big oil in order to fund his election campaign. And we will see a mass rollback of the investments from the Inflation Reduction Act. There was a Wood Mackenzie report that showed that over the between now and 2050, if Trump wins in November, there will be $1 trillion less of investment in renewables. We know that it may be counterintuitive, but doing this improves the chance of a better climate policy going forward, even though it takes some of these cheaper electric vehicles off the field. Now, the one other thing I want to say, and I want to get your reaction, is that right now there are no, or practically no, electric vehicles from China in the United States. There are a couple luxury vehicles, a company called Polestar, which actually, as part of its conglomerate, also includes Volvo, which is now a Chinese company. Those are the only electric vehicles in the US, and it's a very, very small number. The idea of this was to really preempt the concept of a company like BYD, which has the mass market share in China, or Geely, which is this conglomerate which has Buick and Volvo and some of these other companies, some of these other car brands, to come in and specifically to site their factory in Mexico and then use the free trade agreement to bring these cars into the United States. So really a preemptive strike is what's going on here.
Well, I also think it's important to realize that the environmental problem is transitional. This was also the week when the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission issued an order on modernizing and harmonizing the grid. And the faster we can get a modern grid, the less expensive it's going to be for these EVs to buy electricity. And if you can keep China from pricing to market and crowding out our EVs, we can get more EV production in the United States. And the tension between the production aspects and the environmental aspects go away. So I think the important thing is to realize is that this is a transitional problem.
That's absolutely true. And we just spent all this money to facilitate this transition. So the idea that you would spend hundreds of billions of dollars to stand up a homegrown electric vehicle industry and an ecosystem, really, right? Because it's the final assembly, but it's also battery production, it's the minerals production, it's the recycling, all of that stuff. You would build all of that. You would spend tons of money, federal money, taxpayer dollars, and then say, okay, Chinese cars, you come in and undercut all of that work that we did and essentially throw those hundreds of billion dollars in the garbage. No self-respecting administration would ever do that. This is an insurance protection on those investments.
It's also a kind of particularly vivid example of how the Chinese system works across the board, where the targeting of production is mercantilist, it's subsidies, it's dumping, and you have that combined with the theft of intellectual property, combined with the Chinese Communist Party using Chinese companies to spy. And Biden is very serious about not just the dumping of the subsidies, but about challenging the entire Chinese system, but without setting off World War III. And it was interesting, the same week that he announced these tariffs, John Podesta, who has succeeded Kerry as the climate czar, was meeting with his Chinese counterpart about how can we work together to phase out coal. So they're being very astute at carving out areas where they can still cooperate.
And that says to me that this was telegraphed, that they had previously given advance notice to China. This is what we're going to do. We're protecting certain critical industries. We're protecting our investments in those industries. And it's not going to be across the board tariffs. It's not going to be what Trump wants. It's going to be very targeted. And we can still work together on these other issues.
Go ahead.
There
was also some really cheesy commentary that this was a campaign stunt. And if you look at the sweep of Biden's policy, it's been very consistent throughout the 3.5 years of his presidency. And that's just cheap right-wing commentary. It was not an election year stunt.
Now, the one thing I would say is now there is an open door for the U.S. electric vehicle industry, and they need to walk through it. So what we've seen over the last several months is companies like Ford, companies like GM delay some of their investments in electric vehicles because of claims that they cost too much to make, and there's a really interesting accounting strategy that these companies use. You sometimes see this number that Ford or GM loses $100,000 on every electric vehicle. What they're doing there is they're taking into account all the research and development that they've done on electric vehicles, and they're assuming that they're going to spend that much money every year, and that's how they get to that number. It's a ridiculous fiction. It's an accounting fiction that they make up, but it perpetuates itself in them using that number to delay this transition. And
Well,
the fact is, yeah, go ahead.
there is another aspect of this, and you talk about the whole ecosystem. One part of the ecosystem that's underdeveloped is the charging infrastructure. And
That's
so
correct.
you've had some consumer pullback. You've had a lot of chatter that, you know what, hybrids are actually better. And so until we get the charging infrastructure,
Well,
not monopolized by Tesla, but seen as a public utility, consumers are going to hesitate. And so the
and
supply part
that
has
is
to remain sync.
another issue where the US legacy automakers basically engaged in a free rider exchange saying, Tesla, you build the chargers, we'll conform to your charging standard and we'll let you do it. And then what happens 2 weeks ago, Tesla lets go his entire charging team. And so, my only fear here is that the big three sees, oh, the US helped us out. They blocked Chinese cheaper vehicles from coming in. We can coast, we can sell gas guzzlers, all that stuff. And the fact is that the rules that the EPA put in place for tailpipe emissions still are as stringent as they were before out to 2035. They gave a little bit of slack in the first few years, but they're still pretty stringent. And there is basically the future is electric. There is no alternative to building out this transition. And
Well,
the big three really needs to take this seriously and walk through this open door.
I don't know whether this is devil's advocate or whether I actually believe it. Do you think there's a case that the charging infrastructure should just be seen as a public utility?
And by the way, Jared, who made the comment, the EPA's March rulemaking on tailpipe emissions might force the big three's hand. I hope that's exactly what the administration is thinking. They think we've now put in this mandate. We're giving all the space to these companies, all the breathing room that they need to make this transition. As far as charging is concerned, you just say what you asked me before.
So I
Again,
thought Tesla had rigged this so that only Teslas could use their charging station.
no, they didn't. And it looked like Tesla was building actually quite an interesting business through the charging. Over the last several months, Tesla uses a different charging standard than every other EV company.
That's what I'm talking about.
And the US, actually, the Transportation Department said, well, if you're going to get federal money, this charging money that was put together in the infrastructure law, you have to make it adaptable. You have to make it interoperable, essentially. And so Tesla said they would make it interoperable. But what really happened is that Ford and Volkswagen, all these other companies, Hyundai, came to Tesla and said, okay, we'll change to your plug. We will change to your standard if we can use your charging system. And Tesla said, sure. And it sounded like they were going to have a good business selling subscriptions to people who had Fords and GMs and Hyundais to get them to use their charging network. But, Elon Musk his head's in the clouds, and he decided on a whim, like, let's get rid of charging. We're a tech company.
So what happened to all the charging infrastructure?
Well, what's interesting is that Elon has actually hired back a lot of those people this week, realizing the mistake that he made. The chargers basically run themselves. I mean, there's maintenance that needs to be done. That's actually a key thing because, I have an EV and it's not a Tesla, and we're on a different network. It's called Electrify America. And every time I go to an Electrify America station, half the chargers are broken because there's no upkeep, there's no maintenance. It's a big problem in the EV world. Teslas are generally fairly well maintained. The question is, are they going to build it out more?
Well, that's what's scaring off buyers.
It is.
Enough of it.
And Tesla firing everybody in the charging division really scared off people. But now Musk is saying, we actually are going to invest $500 million. The federal system of building public charging networks has really had trouble getting off the ground, but it's starting. You're starting to see some of these built out. But yeah, absolutely, that infrastructure is critical. Getting enough lithium, getting enough cobalt, all of that stuff also critical. But the big three needs to step up and invest in this and realize that this is the future and this is what they need to do if they're going to be competitive. Because I got to tell you, at some point, if you see $9,000 electric vehicles out there, you're not going to be able to hold this off forever. I mean, we have this tariff in place, but it might get to the point where even if you double the cost, it's 100% tariff. You double a $9,000 vehicle, it's $18,000. That's
Oh,
still less than what they're putting out there.
at that point, they would ban sales because the only way you can sell a $9,000 vehicle is to subsidize the crap out of it. And you could have
Well,
400% tariffs, but you might as well just say, sorry, this is a vehicle that is made in violation of every
now,
convention there is in the trading system.
in my talks with the administration officials, they have stressed that, look, uh, Ford is doing a licensing arrangement with CATL. It's a Chinese battery technology company. They're building the batteries here. The jobs are here. They're just using the technology. It's almost a reverse technology transfer, and they say that's okay. That you know, if it's a true transfer, and if CATL can't cut off the spigot, they can't. You know, we won't have the same situation where we're dependent on a Chinese company for the continuing operation, continuing manufacturing. They say that's okay. Where they draw the line is bringing a Chinese automaker into this country, like they did with Toyota and Honda, or even to Mexico. That's gonna and you know that's probably the next flashpoint here. Is I think BYD will try to cite a factory in Mexico and move those cars into the U.S. Duty free. And at that point, you would need something like what they did on the solar panels, a transshipment kind of you know, anti-dumping, countervailing duty kind of situation.
Well, there's also a question of how much of that is bona fide Mexican content and how much of it is just final assembly in Mexico.
Right,
Because
right.
USMCA is pretty tough on that.
That's correct.
All
All right.
right, moving on.
Well, so let's move on. Yes, but it's interesting stuff. The next thing that we both sort of teamed up on was inflation. So we got an inflation number this week. Why don't you tell us about the inflation number and how you know, the components, if you dig into the numbers, aren't the story that is commonly told.
You know, it's really unbelievable the echo chamber of the financial press, traditional economists, and the Fed just reinforcing the conventional wisdom, which is just wrong. And so the way the Bureau of Labor Statistics has constructed the CPI, it misstates what's really going on in several sectors. The worst case of which is housing. Housing is about 1/3 of the entire CPI. And so for starters, if you think about rental housing, if rents are going up 6%, that's not the result of excessive demand in the economy as a whole. It's the result of the fact the United States doesn't have any kind of policy to build affordable homes, just from the get-go. And the Fed's high interest rates make that worse because if you're a developer or a builder, instead of paying 3 or 4% for your money, you're paying 7 or 8% for your money. So it dissuades new construction. An even more egregious case is the way they measure owner-occupied housing. For a variety of technical reasons, none of which are well suited to month-to-month inflation indicators, they calculate the value of a house in terms of the imputed rental value to the homeowner. Right. And the problem with that is homes don't sell very often. So at best, it's a lagging indicator. At worst, it's completely misleading. And Zillow, which has real-time numbers, says that owner-occupied homes are going to inflate at the rate of 2% this year. So if you were to deflate that part of the CPI for what's really going on, you would show inflation well below 3%. And then the other category, Dave, and here I hand the ball to you because this is your expertise, is economic concentration and pricing power. And lo and behold, the other sectors that show the monthly inflation, rather than being 3%, being more like 6 or 7%, guess what? Drugs and hospitals and homeowner insurance, where you have the homeowner insurance
Well,
companies
I can talk about that. Yeah.
taking a bath in some parts of the country, and so they raise rates for everybody else. And then
Right.
you have auto repairs and auto insurance. So if you strip out, this is the point, if you strip out the parts of the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, that
Mhm.
reflect either structural factors or pricing power or bad indicators, the real inflation rate is close to 2%, and 2% is too high anyway, too low anyway, because of
Mhm.
all of the added costs of climate change. So it's so screwed up. And I'm not that good a technical economist. I spent about a half hour looking at the charts. The Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes all these handy charts that go down in detail and subcategories and sub-subcategories. All you got to do is look at it.
I want to react to a couple things that you just said. First thing is we had a comment from Chris Pantocrator, who says, "Happy Friday, love you guys. Do you get the sense that U.S. automakers are doing a lot of EV-centric work behind the scenes?" I mean, we've seen this pullback in investment in the short term. Obviously, if you're talking about the big three, they still make a lot of their bacon off of SUVs and big trucks, the F-150 series and things like that. But behind the scenes, yes, there is work being done. I mean, there's construction going on. Ford's battery facility in Michigan, GM's battery facility in Tennessee. There are things being planned because they have to be planned because they have no choice. There's
Yeah.
an EPA mandate that they have to lower their emissions from cars. So I do think there's work going on, but we need to see it sustained. Okay, now back to your points on inflation, which I thought were very astute. Um, when you're talking about housing, first of all, you have to go back to the Great Recession because after the Great Recession, that was such a pummeling of housing because of the collapse of the housing bubble that tons of home builders went out of business. And those home builders have really not come back. They're very wary of getting into any kind of building situation again. And we've lost a lot of institutional muscle there. So if you look at the charts, there is a dip in housing construction starting in about 2007. And then there was like a lost decade where we built almost no housing for almost a decade. And we lost a lot of the manufacturers and the constructioners who actually did that work to the extent that when we had during the pandemic all of these attempts to do reconstruction in homes, to build onto homes because people wanted to work at home, they needed a second room to do their work and things like that. There was a lumber shortage because they literally didn't have the know-how and enough home builders around to have those relationships to get enough lumber. And there was also a manpower shortage because there just aren't enough construction workers to do all that work. So this is a structural problem, and it has nothing to do with it's largely on the supply side and not on the demand side, and therefore raising interest rates to deal with that is foolish and counterproductive. As you say, we're finally getting people to start coming out and saying, yeah, it may be that what the Fed is doing is actually increasing inflation, not decreasing it. So that's one thing. The second thing I wanted to talk about is auto insurance, because I actually kind of tried to pull back the curtain on auto insurance this week. I did a story about why are auto insurance rates going up so much? And it's really incredible. Over the last year, auto insurance rates have spiked 22.6%. And it's a variety of factors. Some of them are structural. So, for example, cars are more sophisticated now. Everything has a sensor, everything has a computer chip, so that if you get in a fender bender, you might have hit one of those sensors, and it's much more expensive to replace that fender than it was in the past where it was just the metal, right? And so, if obviously auto repairs and auto insurance are going to go up in tandem, right? Because if it's more expensive to repair a car, it's going to be more expensive to insure a car.
Nothing to
So
do with
that's
macro. It has nothing to do.
nothing nothing to do with macro, but that's only one factor. And there actually are more where it's even more interesting and maybe insidious. So you remember in 2020, you may have, and I certainly did, get a check from my auto insurance company. The fact was that during the lockdowns, nobody was driving, and there weren't a whole lot of accident claims going on. And the state insurance regulators, and all of this is regulated at the state level, the state insurance regulators said, "Hey, you have to rebate your customers because you're charging too much now for auto insurance because you're not paying out anything in claims." And so the auto insurance gave back. I remember getting like $150 check or something like that. And there was a report in NPR in 2021 that said, well, actually, the excess that auto insurance companies were told was $42 billion in premiums. They only gave back $13 billion in checks and rebates to the public. So in that time, when they were actually getting a windfall, they kept a lot of the windfall, right? So the shoe's on the other foot now. People came out from the pandemic, started driving like maniacs. I know that's true in California. There were more accidents, so there were more claims paid out. And then the second thing is when interest rates rose, insurance companies are like big institutional investors, and they got caught short on their investments, which were largely tied to interest rates. And they lost their shirts in 2022 and 2023. They've now reinvested and made changes to that investment mix, and they're doing fine. But when they lost money in those 2 years, now they're saying, oh, we got to raise rates. We got to keep, account for that money. So when they made an excess profit, they didn't give it back to the public. But when they lose an excess profit, they got to claw it back from the public, right? So there are a lot of interesting dynamics when it comes to auto insurance, none of which have, as you say, anything to do with macroeconomics, and all of which have to do with the peculiar things in that market. I'll give you one more thing. And that is that electric vehicles we're transitioning to, right? We're selling more and more electric vehicles. And electric vehicles, one of the benefits of them, and I know because I have one, is they don't need maintenance. They don't need oil changes, even though a lot of dealerships sell oil changes with their electric vehicles, which is like a whole fraud thing that I may have more to say about later. They don't need oil changes. They basically need, you rotate the tires and you're about done. So service costs are a large part of a dealership's revenue stream. And so when they lose those service costs on ongoing maintenance because electric vehicles don't need it, they increase the costs on fixes, on repairs, on things like that to balance it out, and so they can make their nut. And as those auto repair costs go up, then the insurance goes up. So there's a whole bunch of factors going on here, and it has a lot to do with coordinated price hikes on the part of the insurance companies more than anything in the macro economy.
Just thinking out loud, let's have a little story conference here for the next 30 seconds. It really would be interesting to go talk to 10 or 20 economists who are one level down, who work for the regional Fed banks, and ask them why they don't take this stuff into account. It's really astonishing that they don't. I was in contact with our friends at the Economic Policy Institute, suggesting that they do a whole report on this. The last time they did a report on how screwed up the CPI is was back during the pandemic, and the CPI was not particularly well calibrated to the pandemic, but now we're in a whole other phase. But it's astonishing that you don't see more economists looking at these factors. And of course, it's the old story of what's wrong with mainstream economics. Mainstream economics does not look at structural factors because that's lumpy, that's messy. That means you got to look at actual cases. You got to look at history. You got to look at institutions. You can't do it with algebra. You can't do it with models. So I think part of this is the institutional blinders that mainstream economics has. And a lot of these people who work at the Fed has 600 PhD economists in their research division. They just have blinders. They're institutionally trained not to look at this stuff.
Right. And they have this assumption that there's one dial that you have to twist if you're dealing with inflation. and
Right.
that is the interest rate dial.
Right.
And they don't take into account the idea that it really can be counterproductive. And we're starting to see more observers. I know our friends at Groundwork Collaborative have been on this, and others, that actually, if you increase the cost of borrowing, you're increasing costs on the American people, and those are major costs like housing,
Well,
that are
credit card borrowing.
credit card borrowing as well. We've seen credit card margins. The CFPB did a great report on this. Credit card margins are at their highest point ever, and large credit card issuers have higher margins than smaller credit card issuers. Of course, it's very hard to find out what your credit card rates will be as you're shopping. There are these websites like Credit Karma that say, "Hey, shop for the best credit card deal. We'll tell you what the best offers are." And those are ads. The credit card companies actually pay to get to the top of that list on Credit Karma and some of these other places. One of the things the CFPB is doing is they're creating a public option for credit card shopping websites where they'll put all the data. They won't push you to the top if you happen to pay them off. They'll tell you, look, this credit union here in Missouri has the best credit card deals, and you should probably go to them. So, the Biden administration is starting to be a little bit aggressive here on some of the most egregious things that are happening with respect to prices. But some of the things they can't do in this particular interest rate environment, and that's on the Fed. All right. So speaking of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, who I mentioned here just a second ago, there was a really important and powerful ruling at the Supreme Court yesterday, which was a case that was brought by payday lenders and claiming that the CFPB's funding structure was unconstitutional. And the Fifth Circuit, which is this notorious conservative, arch conservative circuit in Texas and Louisiana, said, yes, we agree. The funding structure is unconstitutional. And if this would have gone through, this would have created a whole mess. Not just it would have taken this consumer protection agency off the field, but there are a whole bunch of safe harbors and things of this nature. It would have really roiled mortgage markets. It would have destroyed lending markets all over the country. And fortunately, the Supreme Court didn't take the bait. They didn't do that. It was a 7-2 ruling that Clarence Thomas, no less, wrote the opinion on, saying, look, an appropriation is just something that where if Congress says we are appropriating this funds through this mechanism for this purpose, we're going to let it go. And that's all the CFPB is. It's the funds are appropriated to the Federal Reserve. They're capped by Congress at a certain number that's inflation adjusted. The CFPB asks for money from the Fed, and the Fed gives it to them. And that is perfectly legal, and it's in line with tons of federal regulators and things like that all over the country, including several federal financial regulators. And so the Supreme Court blessed it.
Well, I found that in more than half of the stories that I've done over the past 2 weeks, the fingerprints of one Elizabeth Warren were all over the stories. And so it was Warren who came up not only with the idea of the CFPB, but with a funding mechanism. And she realized that if the Fed, which doesn't need money from Congress because the Fed finances its own budget, can be legal, and ditto the FDIC, then you can use the same mechanism for the CFPB by nesting it in the Fed. And what was interesting about the Thomas decision was that as an originalist, 90% of what he said in the decision was about how funding was done in the early republic. So he's using this to prove his originalist bona fides, but the bottom line is, yeah, you can do it. And just staying with the Warren theme. So,
well, just one
yeah,
thing there, because I think the important point is why she set up the funding mechanism in that way, and it was to
insulate it from political interference.
That's correct. And when you see agencies that are funded in this way, it doesn't mean that they all are crusaders against malfactors in the economy, but it certainly is better than looking over your shoulder at an appropriator and thinking, oh, I better not go after this agency because they're going to cut my budget, because that company that I go after is going to fund the appropriator, and then the appropriator is going to say, you can't spend that money. So
or
it was all about political independence.
Some member of Congress may have a corrupt relationship with some entity that's being regulated and put pressure on the regulator to go easy. And if that member of Congress controls my budget, I'm going to think twice. So,
all right. One more thing on CFPB,
yep.
and then we can go on to this other stuff that Warren did this week, which is prodigious. So I want to go on to it. There are 14 separate cases in play in the government in the courts right now, where there are stays or stoppages to the case because of the waiting on this ruling. A company was accused of predatory lending, or it said it was the CFPB sought a civil investigative demand. They wanted to investigate a company, and the company said, well, your funding's unconstitutional, so we have to stop. So all of those cases, which are in courts right now and they're under a stay, have to be lifted. That stay needs to be lifted because the Supreme Court has ruled. None of them have yet been lifted. I know it's been a day, but courts can move pretty swiftly on these things. The other thing is that the CFPB put together a cap on credit card late fees down to $8. Where now they're about $41. They closed a loophole in the Card Act of 2009, basically, by saying that the Card Act said you can only charge a fee up to the cost of what it would take to reverse that fee, and the cost of collecting on late charges is $8 per late fee, essentially. So that's what they calculated. A Texas court put that under an injunction because of the Fifth Circuit said that the funding structure was unconstitutional. They have not lifted that either. CFPB has written several briefs to the Fifth Circuit saying, why haven't you lifted this stay? Why haven't you done? And they're just dragging their feet on it. And this is a rule that is, according to the CFPB's numbers, will save the American people $10 billion a year. And you have a rogue court in Texas saying, we can't do anything about it because of the Supreme Court. And even after the Supreme Court rules, they are dragging their feet on allowing that to go forward. So it's just crazy. All right. End quote. Now you can go ahead with your Warren stuff.
Well, if you think about some of the interesting stuff that's happened in the past couple of weeks, so you have the FAA. And Buttigieg, after being not very aggressive for his first 3 years, finally got religion and issued some very pro-consumer regs, one of the most important of which is that you don't have to jump through all these hoops that the airlines create. If your flight is delayed or canceled, you get a cash refund. Simple, end of story. And so in the dead of night, in the FAA authorization rather, the lobbyists get to the committee chair, and lo and behold, the committee chair is Maria Cantwell of Washington State, a kind of a pro-tech Democrat.
Pro-Boeing.
Pro-Boeing, pro bono. They reverse it. And so Warren,
what they specifically said is that they put into law that customers would have to ask affirmatively for that refund.
Yeah, but it's not just
which creates all
a refund, because that allows
all the problems that were there before. People have to know that. They have to jump through the hoops of a website. They can, it's a stall tactic and delay tactic that allows the airlines to not have to pay out. Absolutely.
Oh, long story short, Warren notices this, gets a Republican partner, Josh Hawley, to raise hell about it, goes on social media, goes on television, buttonholes Cantwell involves the White House, and she gets it turned around in 2 days. So it's classic Warren. And
Yeah.
then another
And
story.
now it's even better because it's in law. It's now in statute
Right.
that
That's
these
right.
refunds are automatic. There's another thing that Buttigieg did, which was you have to list all the fees up front, like all in pricing. And the airlines are actually fighting that in court. They went to court to try to block that. They have not gone to court to block the automatic refunds because it's in statute. So they
Right.
know that they can't stop it. So that's the power of statute, and that's why it's important what Senator Warren did.
Well, and then you have the case of Marty Gruenberg, FDI chairman, beleaguered. Democrats were not quite sure they wanted to rally to his defense. He's in trouble because of this mess at the FDIC, which was a kind of a frat house for sexual harassment. And had Gruenberg been forced out, the Republican would have been the chair of the agency, and no pro-consumer regs would have happened for the rest of the year. And Warren basically said, "You guys are complete hypocrites. When the Republicans had the chairmanship, you didn't do anything about it. And by the way, what about Donald Trump?" And she even had two of her closest allies coach Gruenberg on his testimony, her
Yeah,
former chief of staff and the head of the CFPB worked with Marty on his testimony. So, and he barely escaped. I mean, he was called on the carpet before two hearings this week, House, Senate, and they have failed to force his resignation. So
at least thus far. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
well, but no, if the axe was going to fall, it was going to fall this week. And so, between that and the CFPB and the FAA, and also she's just been a demon on the Steward bankruptcy.
Right.
She's
I mean,
going to
we can talk
introduce
about that because that's
she's
out
going to
in
introduce
Massachusetts.
legislation that private equity cannot play in the entire healthcare sector,
Oh,
which
that's
is,
interesting. When's
is the
that coming out?
a week or two. She's working on it. She's put out a
Mm-hmm.
release. She's working on it. So, and again, this is a woman who was the outstanding bankruptcy expert in the country when she was a law professor at Harvard. So she really knows bankruptcy better than anybody. And the game with Stewart is to try and keep control via a bankruptcy. So she's all over that. Anyway,
Yeah,
it's
we've had we had Mo Takacic write a piece about the
an
Stewart bankruptcy.
unbelievable story.
Yeah, and it was she related it to the FTX bankruptcy. So FTX was the crypto company, Sam Bankman-Fried, that got blown up, and he's in jail now for fraud, and because in her view, her framing is because they actually treated that like a crime, that the customers of FTX are actually getting something back for their money. Now part of this is because the price of Bitcoin, the price of all of these assets that FTX had ended up appreciating over the 2 years of the bankruptcy. But now, those customers are getting 143% of what they had in. They're getting all their money back and interest. Whereas with the Stewart bankruptcy, these creditors are going to be lucky to see a dime because all of this money is being taken out by consultants and lawyers. It's not being treated as the fraud that it is, and we're not getting the clawbacks on the companies that made their money from Stewart, both at the executive level, the individuals like Ralph Delator, and the private equity companies like Cerberus, which did this sweetheart deal and got out of Stewart with $1 billion or something.
Well, and what Mo did in that great story was she went through the gazillions of pages of bankruptcy filings and looked at
Right.
exactly where the corruption was. And there's so much corruption and fraud in what they did, beginning with Cerberus taking out a billion too in 2006, putting it in their own pockets at the expense of the hospital. The only way these hospitals are going to be made whole is if they claw back some of that money via a criminal prosecution where the settlement includes some restitution. And
Right.
unless this heads in that direction, um, some of the creditors are going to get back a little bit of money, but it's the hospitals and the doctors and the patients who are going to be left holding the bag.
Yeah, I mean, your view is that you don't see how these hospitals, and there are something like, I don't know the exact number, but
32,
it's
I think.
okay, 32, 33 hospitals. You don't see how they can be going concerns unless we get that clawback. And just explain that.
Well, if you take now the gimmick that they used was a sale leaseback deal, right? So
Yeah.
that's another thing. The Massachusetts let me back up two steps.
Okay.
So the gimmick was um, we're gonna we Cerberus will sell the physical property on which the hospital is located, including the hospital buildings, including all the hospital facilities.
Right.
We'll sell that to a real estate investment trust, the medical property trust, and then the medical
Right.
property trust will charge the hospital's rent, and we will pocket the $1.2 billion. Well, once that happened, there was no way the hospitals would have enough money to operate
Right.
because they're stuck with paying rent.
And this
And
is very common, by the way, sale leasebacks or something. You see them, they're common in things like retail, like Toys R Us had a
yes,
sale
of
leaseback.
course.
You don't see them in hospitals very often.
Well, and there's legislation right now pending in the Massachusetts legislature to make sale leaseback deals illegal in the whole
Mm,
hospital sector. Closing
hmm.
the barn door after the horse escapes, but at
Yeah.
least
Yeah.
they understand what's going on. So the only source of serious money that could be returned to the hospitals so that you don't end up with a government bailout uh, is to claw back a lot of that 1.2 billion. And you already have horrible spillovers in Massachusetts where in the 8 hospitals that are located in Massachusetts, patients are deserting those hospitals either because they can't be treated, the hospital doesn't have the staff, or because they don't have confidence in the quality. And so nearby hospitals are overwhelmed, taking on patients that used to go to Steward hospitals. So it's a fustercluck. I mean, it's a real mess on multiple
Yeah.
fronts. And
All right.
the only way to make
Great.
them whole is to get that money back.
Okay, great. So we got about 10 minutes left, and it's an election year, so we might as well dig into a couple things on the Biden race. There was a lot of I think angst from liberals after the Siena New York Times poll, which always gets liberals in a tizzy because it's the New York Times. Came out and showed Biden still down in the swing states that he needs to win the election, down by a trivial amount in the really the main states, which are the states in the industrial Midwest, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, but down. And so, in a bid to shake up the race, and we haven't talked about this, but I want to get your take on it. So Biden came out and said, "Actually, I want to debate you, Donald Trump, in late June." And I don't want to go through the Commission on Presidential Debates. I want to just me and you in a studio. And CNN said, we'll do it. And Donald Trump said, okay. And they're going to do one in June and they're going to do one in September. And what do you think of that gambit of Biden, sort of calling the bluff on Trump saying anytime, any place, I'll debate you? And, what do you think it portends for the future?
It's really interesting. Biden can be very, very good when he is scripted. So he was terrific in the State of the Union. The
Right.
question is, how much can he rehearse when he's impromptu? And I thought in the CNN interview last week, he was dreadful. I mean, he stepped on his lines, he groped for words, he couldn't uh, keep his story straight. And so I think the gamble they're making is that Trump is even more chaotic when he's impromptu. And what I worry about is that when you net out everything, Trump radiates energy and Biden doesn't. So it's a gamble. It's a Hail Mary pass. But I think Biden has more to gain and Trump has more to lose if he can just keep his line straight.
Right. The thing about energy, actually, I want to pick up on because there's been this kind of, and the Siena poll bore this out. They literally showed that certain percentages of people blamed Biden for the Dobbs ruling. I mean, it just, you see these things where Biden doesn't get credit for his accomplishments. People don't know what they are, and they even give him blame for things that he had nothing to do with, right? And so what kind of a problem is this? Is this a media problem? Is this a public literacy problem? What is the problem? But I think what you just said is part of the problem. And that is, so in 2020, Biden, during the race, what he said he was going to do, and what he then did after 2020 is he said, I'm going to let you guys rest a little bit. I'm not going to be in your face every day. I'm not going to be throwing tweets up. I'm not going to be, the kind of president where there's always drama and I'm the center of attention. I'm not going to do that. The problem is the public learned that in the previous 4 years, that what the president does is makes himself the center of attention, the lead character in his own story. And when Biden sort of consciously pulled back in the first 2 years because he wanted to negotiate with Congress to get what he wanted, right? When he did that, the messaging, I think, implicitly the public got is nothing's happening. It's kind of like the dial was revved up to 11 under Trump, and Biden took it back to 2, and people got used to the dial. They got used to the dial meaning forward motion, even though as a legislative matter, Trump had almost no accomplishments and Biden had a ton of accomplishments. But it was about that volume meter being a stand-in for energy and action and actual legislative advance. And I think that's a big part of the problem.
Oh, I agree. But and there are two parts to this. So take this conversation between you and me. We're both high energy guys, right? We're talking forcefully. We really care about this stuff. We're also talking coherently. We can actually remember what we're trying to say and we can put words together. Biden is low energy. Sometimes he's very low energy. He talks in a monotone. He's got a reedy voice. And sometimes he can't keep his line straight. He's groping for words. So the gamble is that even though we know Trump is high energy, that he comes off as even more coherent, more contradictory, more chaotic, and Biden comes across as the steadier hand. I think that's the gamble that Biden's handlers are making.
That's absolutely the gamble for this debate. I'm saying that there was a strategy, and by the way, it's a communication strategy. It's not just about Biden. There was a communication strategy to kind of pull back on the presidency for 4 years. And I think because Trump defined the presidency is to such a degree that pulling back actually had the reverse effect than what the administration and its top officials thought it would do.
Well, and
he
also
thought it would reassure the public. Did not reassure the public. It made the public think nothing was going on.
Well, also the commentators concluded from that Biden's staff didn't want to let him out in public because they weren't
that was another part
of his ability. So I think this is an effort to show that, okay, we are confident that he's pretty good in public, and State of the Union message suggests there are times when he is rather good. The Holocaust speech, which I faulted because he could have at least acknowledged that Palestinians are people, but absent that, it was a very good speech. So he can give a good speech. The question is, can he memorize enough of the talking points for a debate that he can come across as well as he comes across in prepared speeches?
Yeah, I think that's right. And so obviously, late June. I think the other thing is that Biden wants to make this real earlier.
Yes, that's right.
There are certainly people out there who are not paying attention, who don't know that we're having a rematch, and who don't really remember what it's like to deal with Donald Trump every day on their television screens. And so I think there's an attempt to sort of pull forward and jar people into, yeah, this is happening, and you're going to have to make a choice.
Well, and a lot of smart commentators make the argument, I don't know how you prove this, that once people focus on the fact that, yeah, there's an election coming, you're going to have a lot of hesitant Democrats returning to Biden.
Potentially. I mean, we'll certainly see. All right. Well, we are about out of time. Bob Kuttner, thank you so
Always a
much.
pleasure.
Always a
Thank you, David.
pleasure. Thank you. And we will post this on our website as we always do. And then we'll be back next week at 12:30 Eastern. And I hope you'll come along for the ride then. Thank you very much for joining us and have a great rest of your day.